All right, so referencing worksheets in VBA is a little more complex than referencing workbooks. So I have an example macro here that has a bunch of different examples in it, and I'm going to step through each of these. So the first one here is active sheet, and that's very similar to active workbook. This is just going to return the active sheet or the sheet that the user has selected within the workbook. So if I move my VB editor over here, you can see currently that my active sheet is this cover sheet here. That's the one that's selected. So if I run this code, and the message box line here is just going to show us a message box and then output the name of the active sheet. So I'm going to hit F8 to step through this. F8 will show us that message box with the sheet name here. Okay. Now the next one is the worksheets name. So the worksheets is also a collection, and basically that's a collection of all the worksheets in either the active workbook or the workbook we're referencing. In this case, we're not referencing a workbook, so VBA is going to assume that we're referring to the active workbook. So all the worksheets in the active workbook are returned in a collection, and then we can just reference one of those sheets by name, and we just put it in quotes here. So this cover sheet is in quotes. That would be referencing this sheet here, and this line of code is just going to count all the rows in that specific sheet. So I'll hit F8, and that'll show us 1,048,000. Okay. So since that's a collection of worksheets, we can also reference the worksheets by the index number. And that's what this is here. The 2 is just the index number, basically, of the sheet, or the order that the sheet's in within the workbook. So this would be the second sheet in the workbook. In this case here, it's named second sheet. So this is going to return the second sheet in the workbook. And now, instead of a message box, I'm going to basically use this debug print line. So this will actually print out the sheet name in the immediate window down here. I'll go ahead and clear these out so you don't see these. So now when I hit F8, this is going to return the sheet name of sheet 2 in the immediate window down here. So it's just going to print that out. Now we can also reference the sheet name by the sheet's code name. So this is different than the actual worksheet name itself. This is a code name for the worksheet. If we look over here in the project window, you'll see basically under the My First Macro workbook, under this folder here, there's a list of all the sheets in the workbook. And you can see the first thing here within the sheet is the code name. So this sheet 1 is assigned to the sheet by Excel. It's not something that the user can change. They would actually be changing this name here for sheet 1. A better example up here is in this book 1. You can see here's my sheet name. It's called second sheet, but the code name for that sheet is sheet 1. And this name can actually be changed. It can be changed down here in the properties window. You can go in and change the code name for the sheet, and we'll talk about more about that in later videos. But using the code name is a much more secure method of referencing the sheet because the user can't change the name or the order of the sheets. So for example, if the user was to change the name of the sheet from cover sheet, this line of code might error out because if it doesn't find the word cover sheet or the name cover sheet in the worksheets collection, it's going to return an error. So this is a more secure line of code. The only caveat is you can only use it to reference this current workbook. So you can't reference another workbook and then call sheet 1. Sheet 1 right now, if I return this, even though the active workbook is here and the sheet 1 code name for the active workbook would be second sheet, this is not going to return second sheet. So I'll hit F8, and basically you can see it returns sheet 1. Click OK. Again, that's because this code module is in this My First Macro workbook. This isn't the workbook we're currently looking at over here. We're actually looking at book 1, as you can see there. So that's where it can get a little confusing because this is actually sheet 1 here is actually referencing the sheet object within this workbook that the code module's in. This code module's right here within the My First Macro workbook. So that's a few different ways to reference sheets. Now it's very important to also qualify the sheets with a workbook. So the worksheet itself is part of the workbook object or a member of the workbook object. So you'll always want to qualify the workbook that you're referring to somehow. So in this case, we could just say active workbook, or we can basically look at any of those other options we looked at in the previous video. These are all the workbook reference types that we could reference for our worksheet. So it's always a good idea to qualify your worksheet with a workbook name. That way VBA knows and doesn't accidentally run your code on a worksheet in a workbook that you didn't specify. Now, if you're developing an add-in or something and you want the code to run in the active workbook that the user has open, then you can reference it with active workbook like this line of code is doing. But it's always a good idea to basically qualify your worksheets with a workbook. The other thing I wanted to point out is that you won't always get IntelliSense for the worksheets. So for example, if I type worksheets here, and then I'll just reference the second worksheet in the workbook and hit a dot, you'll see that there's no IntelliSense here for the worksheets. And that just happens sometimes. One way to get IntelliSense for the worksheet object is if you type the code name instead. So if I type sheet 1 here and then put my dot, now I'll see all the methods and properties for the worksheet itself. So that's a good way to get some code if you don't see the IntelliSense when you're referencing a worksheet. If you just wanted to activate that sheet, you could just select that one there and say OK, and then you could go back and put whatever worksheet reference you want in here in front of it. So that's one way to kind of work with the IntelliSense, just kind of a little quick tip there. So that's an overview of how to reference worksheets in your workbooks. Again, there's a lot of different options there, and you'll just learn these over time as you start coding in VBA. So don't expect to learn them all at once, but there's some options to work with.